and they have value and they have rights, and we don't see people like that. And I think the reason for that, we're going to get into this starting next week for 4 weeks. We're going to talk about creation, and I want you guys to be a part of worship by bringing like vacation pictures and just anything about creation that you think is beautiful and awesome and would add to worship. Like email it to me, bring it, and we want to use that as our worship for the next 4 weeks to be able to say, hey, here's been in the woods hunting, and look how beautiful the trees are, that kind of a thing. So we're going to do that. So be involved in our worship in that way, if you would. Maybe think about that. But I think a huge problem that we have is that we have a world that over time, over the last 150 years especially, has decided that there isn't a God, right? That Darwin and his whole evolution thing, and before you know it, we have school systems that don't talk about God. We have a culture that doesn't talk about God. And we think it's bad here. Man, Europe is so far more gone as far as God being left out of everything. And when you take God out of everything, all of a sudden, people are just randomly here, and we lose something really big, don't we? We lose value. There's not a great God who made us anymore. Actually, I came from a single-cell organism that happened to emerge out of ooze. So it's pretty easy to eliminate me if I'm annoying, right? Because I don't have any value. And we see that in our culture. We see when cultures tank, when countries tank, and they just start to go downhill, we see a loss of value for people. So we see abortion, that we don't take care of babies, even in the most sacred place and safest place for them, right inside their mama's tummy, right? And so we see culture start to tank because there's no value for that anymore. Cultures that disrespect their elderly and don't take care of them and don't love them, the same kind of thing. Handicapped, people who struggle with mental disabilities and things like that easily get pushed to the sidelines in cultures. And when we think about the value of people, we have to know that that value comes from God. That's what makes people valuable. And so we look at our culture and we see through our history different races being oppressed as not being as valuable, right? We see abortion just rampant because we don't value that life, because God has been ignored and cast aside. And if that value of those people doesn't come from God, where does it come from? You could see it in history in Nazi Germany, right? That a whole race of people would be considered not valuable, and that we would just kill them off. Not we, but Hitler and his bad people. Yeah. When a culture starts to stop seeing people as valuable, when we dethrone God and pretend He's not there, there's 3 things that start to happen, okay? And you can write these down if you want. And these are the 3 things that start to happen. The things that are good, like life, beautiful things, truth, and those kind of things, the things that used to be beautiful and used to be celebrated start to become condemned. So the things that are beautiful and used to be celebrated are things that start to become condemned. And you can see that in our culture. You can see that things that for so long have been important and have been thought of as right now are looked upon as being intolerant and negative. And so things that are good start to be seen as bad. And in a culture like that dethrones God, things that used to be seen as bad, and this one's probably more obvious to us, are now seen as good. Do you see that in our culture? That for hundreds of years in America, we had the Bible at the center of so much, and things were, even people who didn't go to church and maybe wouldn't have called themselves Christians had the underlying guidance of this. It was just part of the culture. And there was things that were seen as bad and that were wrong, and people, avoided divorce, and homosexuality wasn't talked about, and all of this kind of thing. And now in our flip of culture, since we've dethroned God, now we look at those things and we say, those things are good. They're to be praised, right? Our culture praises those things now. And the last one is this, and I think cultures who have gone through this kind of thing, where they dethrone God, the things that are good are seen as bad all of a sudden, the things that are negative and bad are now seen as good, because we are all messed up if we don't have God directing us. And before you know it, the people who celebrate the things that are good are also condemned. That the people who love God and love His truth, we start to not fit in as much, and we also will be condemned in a culture that dethrones God right along with those good things and that truth and those practices. And you see that throughout different cultures. The Roman Empire, highly Christian, started with people in the early church and with the disciples, and they're in a totally pagan world, and the message spreads, and there are 80 million Christians in the world at the time of Constantine, but that degraded and was just gone because of, again, the same kind of thing, the ignorance of God and the lack of putting Him where He's supposed to be. All right, here we go. Let's get into the Bible. So we're talking about God being on the throne, that Him being the Creator has given us value, that we live in a culture where that value is taken away because we've taken God away. Does that make sense? Are we all tracking? All right, I know that's sometimes hard to get through that part. All right, here we go. Let's talk about value, okay? I happen to have brought a couple coins. You can't steal them because they're valuable to me, but you can look at them. Not that you would steal them. I would steal these. If I was sitting in the crowd and there was a pastor talking and he sent around these coins, I wouldn't be able to help myself. I'd be like, I'd put a quarter, pass a quarter to the next person and take this one home. Woo! These are so cool. That's how cool these are. I wouldn't really do that, by the way. Here's a couple coins from ancient times, and they have Caesar on them. And I'll start them up here, one over here. So you can look at them. This one on this side has Augustus, and then this one has Nero, who was Caesar, and then on the other side it has Tiberius. Tiberius was Caesar during the time of Jesus' adulthood, okay? So take a look at those and pass them around while I'm talking. And let's read, if you're in Matthew 22, let's start in verse 15, and here we go. Then the Pharisees went out and laid plans to trap Jesus, to trap Him in His words. They sent their disciples to Him along with the Herodians. Herodians would have been political leaders who sided with King Herod. Teacher, they said, we know you are a man of integrity and that you teach the way of God in accordance with the truth. You aren't swayed by men because you pay no attention to who they are. Tell us then, what is your opinion? Is it right to pay taxes to Caesar or not? So we're going to look at three different areas where spiritual, religious leaders and political leaders of Jesus' day are trying to trick Him into messing up so they can say, hey, look at what a fool Jesus is. Or they can say, hey, Romans, go arrest this guy. And here's the first one. The Pharisees go up to Jesus, and they're talking to Him with the Herodians, which brings in politics. And by the way, all of these groups are enemies. The Pharisees, the Herodians, we're going to talk about the Sadducees, and you guys have heard these described throughout our Matthew series. These guys are all enemies of each other in the political realm, but they all can unite on one thing. Can you guess what the one thing they can unite on is? Being against Jesus. So here they are, against Jesus. And the Pharisees went out and laid plans to trap Him, right? They sent their disciples to Him, along with Herodians. Teacher, they said, we know that you are a man of integrity. So they kind of butter Him up. We know you're a man of integrity, but watch how we bring you down in a second. We know you're a man of integrity and that you teach the way of God in accordance with the truth. You aren't swayed by men because you pay no attention to them. And then they ask Him the question that they think you just won't be able to, figure out. Is it right to pay taxes to Caesar or not? But Jesus, knowing their evil intent, said, you hypocrites, why are you trying to trap me? Show me the coin used for paying the tax. So there, you guys all have a coin that would have really been used for paying the tax. That's pretty cool. Show me the coin used for paying the tax. And they brought Him a denarius, and He asked them, whose portrait is this? And whose inscription? And so the one that's floating around here, where did it go to? It's all the way back there. So there it is with Caesar Augustus on it. And if you have a light on it and I don't know, you can kind of see Augustus spelled in there. They use a V instead of a U in Latin, but yeah. So he is holding up a coin like that, and he's saying to the people, hey, whose picture is on this? And all the people answer, Caesar's, right? Caesar's picture's on it. Caesar's, they replied, and then he said to them, well, give to Caesar what's Caesar's, and to God what is God's. Now to the Jews, it was really important not to worship an image of something that wasn't God, right? And so they're trying to trap him in that and get him in, strangled up in a law and be like, oh, we can't touch those coins because they have, a graven image on them and all this kind of stuff. And Jesus is saying to them something just so obvious. He says, well, he holds it up. Whose picture's on it? Caesar's. Well, it has Caesar's picture on it. It's his image, so it must belong to him. So give it to him. If Caesar wants his picture on it and he loves it that much, just give it to him. And that's, he doesn't get trapped. We get trapped in all these political things. And Jesus is just like, Caesar's picture's on it, just give it to him. Who cares? And then he says this, he says, and to God, what is God's? Give to God what is God's. Well, what's God's image on? It's on people. So you see the play there? The play on the thoughts and the ideas? Caesar's image is on that, give it to him. They would not have missed the use of the word image there, because it comes all the way back from Genesis. The Jews knew the Bible. They knew this idea of what it meant to be made in God's image. And so Jesus says, Caesar finds that valuable and he put his picture on it, give it to him. What does God find valuable? Give to God what's God's. You, right? And I love that because I think he's just talking about value again. Like we look at the world and we think, oh, I got to have, all this stuff and the government's doing this and this and it's kind of scary and what's it going to look like in 10 years? Are my kids going to grow up in an America where they can't sit down and have Thanksgiving dinner with their family because it's just so screwed up? Like, when we think about that, I've thought about that kind of stuff. I felt like a pilgrim the other day sitting in the living room with Charity, and I was like thinking about where we can go, Like, I wonder what country we can go to where they're not going to do weird stuff, because it's going down pretty fast. Texas is going to be a country soon, that's true. We're all going there. And I just thought back to that. I thought back and I was like, Charity, it wasn't that long ago that there's these people called pilgrims with their cool hats, and they were sitting around in a room and they were talking about the same thing, But man, we don't have to worry about all of that. I don't think. We have so much value to God. We're made in His image. He has something He's laid on us as a responsibility to be His image bearers. And He says, just give to Caesar what's Caesar's and, give to God what's God's. That's us. I think that as Christians, this is a passage that people will talk about government with. If you want to write down Romans 13, that's another passage people will talk about when they talk about how Christians relate to government. Romans 13. And then if you want to write down 1 Peter 2, 13 through 18, that'd be another passage that people use when they talk about Christians in relation to government. And you want to know what I really think about Christians in relation to government? I think that we should be the best citizens that are out there. Don't you think? We should be the best citizens that are out there. God, if you read these passages, you find that God uses government to accomplish His purposes. That He uses government so the whole world isn't falling apart, shooting each other, that there's some stability and there's some rules so that He can get His message across. That we're called to obey our leaders. We're called to pray for our leaders. And you know what? If whoever the president is makes a rule or a law that persecutes us, what are we supposed to do? We're supposed to pray for the one who's persecuting us. Isn't that interesting? At this conference this week, these great pastors that are known throughout all the world and teach throughout all the world are getting up front and they're really working on my mindset as it comes to how messed up our world is. And one of them went up front and he prayed for President Obama. He prayed that his marriage would be strong. He prayed that his daughters would be safe and would grow up to be, great young women. He prayed for them to be saved and for God to just wash over them. He prayed for those kind of things too. But you could tell that he was loving somebody because he also, President Obama, is made in the image of God, right? And so we need to think of it that way. We also need to think, and we talked about this last week, our battle isn't against all these people who make laws or people who, might look at something FaithWay does and say, you guys are intolerant and blah, 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 and all that kind of stuff. Or maybe in your life, you stood up in work and you've said something you believe and you're taking heat for it, which the Bible says will happen. Our battle's not against those people. And if you can remember the value they have because God created them, and then remember that God says our battle isn't against flesh and blood, but against the powers and principalities of darkness, that there's a spiritual world that is influencing these people who are being fooled and tricked into believing this way, we can have so much compassion for our enemies, can't we? Knowing Satan's behind it, knowing there are people made in the image of God too. And so Jesus is just brilliant. He could have denied taxes and been like, I ain't paying taxes to Caesar. You know what that money goes for? Right? And they would have gone and got soldiers and arrested him for going against Caesar. Or he could have been like, we should be giving taxes to Caesar? Yeah, pay honor to Caesar, right? And then he would have lost his following because the people would have seen him as a sellout. And Jesus, in his brilliance, because of who he is, says, well, his picture's on it, so I guess he really likes that coin, so just give it to him. You know what God really likes? God really likes you. Isn't that cool? Pretty cool. So then there's the next group who wants to fool Jesus, and everybody thinks they got Jesus right where they want him. And as soon as they think that, Jesus knows that he has them right where he wants them, which is just beautiful. So let's read the next one, marriage and the resurrection. So here's the next group. That same day, the Sadducees, kind of religious, mostly political. So many jokes I could say right now about different things, but I'm not going to. That same day, the Sadducees, who say there is no resurrection, came to him with a question. Teacher, they said, Moses told us, like in person, right? Like Moses told us, the Bible, the Old Testament told them. Teacher, they said, Moses told us that if a man dies without having children, his brother must marry the widow and have children for him. Now there were 7 brothers among us. The first one married and died, and since he had no children, he left his wife to his brother. The same thing happened to the second and third, right down all the way to the 7th. And finally, the woman died. I mean, it's so silly. But there was somebody who commented on this week, and he was like, this is the first black widow. First black widow. Who wants to marry? Who wants to marry this lady? It was so funny. I mean, it's so true. Well, the first one died, then the second one. I mean, she wiped out a whole family all by herself. Verse 27, finally the woman died. She probably deserved it because these people couldn't have died of natural causes. Finally the woman died. Now then at the resurrection, whose wife will she be of the 7, since all of them were married to her? Like, that's a pretty well thought out way to trick somebody and question them, right? So, John has 42 girlfriends and blah, 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 blah. Yes, there you go. Minus 40. How many does that make in heaven? All right. Verse 29, Jesus replied, and this is great. All right, here you go. It is okay to love people, know they're valued by God, and Jesus shows us we can still show them that they're wrong and try and lead them towards truth, okay? You don't have to be walked all over as a Christian. We can bear the truth in love and be his ambassadors. No king wants an ambassador that goes to another country and is supposed to show, hey, this is what our country is like, this is what our president thinks, these are the goals and values that we have, and we're trying to portray this, you know, to you. I'm an ambassador to your country, this is what my country's like, and they get there and they're just like, all right, we'll do it your way. You know, like, we're not supposed to be like that. We're Christ's ambassadors, right? And Jesus says to them, you're in error because you don't know the scriptures or the power of God. Ever thought that before? Somebody's talking and you're just like sitting there, and then you would just, dude, you don't know what you're talking about because you don't know the Bible or anything about the power of God. That's what he says. I mean, if that doesn't apply. You are in error because you don't know what you're talking about, because you don't know the scriptures, and you don't know the power of God. And then he says, at the resurrection, people will neither marry nor be given in marriage. They will be like angels in heaven. But about the resurrection of the dead, have you not read what God said to you? I am the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. He is not the God of the dead, but of the living. And when the crowds heard this, they were astonished at his teaching. Again, Jesus shows the value of image bearers, right? The value God has for people made in his image. The Sadducees didn't believe in a resurrection. They didn't have hope in that way. The world doesn't have hope in that way. As we minister to people and we love people who don't know the truth, and I teach you like this, like we're already like in the midst of all these atheists who are yelling at us and all that kind of stuff. And I know that's not the case for all of us, but I really hope FaithWay becomes like that. That we're the ones who go out because we know God's word and we know the power of God, and we're the ones who approach and love those people, so we have these kind of conversations, right? Those people don't have hope. They don't know they're made in the image of God. They have no hope of anything past this life. They're trying to gain meaning in life by jumping into a cause that Satan has tricked them into thinking, is the answer to having good life. And as we work with these kind of people, Jesus gives us more truth. Number 2 on your paper, hope and security are built on truth. That when we know God's word, we know the truth. Well, Jesus happens to know the Bible, and Jesus happens to know the power of God, and so he can say to them, as a representative of God and being God himself, you guys are wrong. You don't know the Bible. You don't know the power of God. And actually, we do have hope because we're made in God's image, and he loves each and every one of us. And the resurrection is something that will happen, and every person is valued enough that they will be resurrected. Every person. Everyone. And they will either spend forever with God in their resurrected body, or they will spend forever with Satan in hell because they've rejected that God. There is value in the person. And he teaches them that, and it's based off of truth, right? And we live in a world where God has been dethroned. And, studying the creation stuff, like I wanted to be like, here's a flower, and it's beautiful, and here's how it proves that there's a designer and a real God, and we're going to do some of that kind of thing. But the more I got into it, the more God was just revealing to me, like, this is why your world's this messed up. Because they've totally gotten rid of the idea of a creator, so there's no values, there's no morals, there's no truth for people to stand on. People are deciding what truth is right for them, what morals are right for them, and they're making their own way, and they're doing just what the book of Judges says. When Israel was being so bad, it says that they all did what was right in their own eyes, because they don't know the Bible and they don't know the power of God. So they're doing what's right in their own eyes, and they're becoming gods to themselves. I'll decide. Nobody created me. I'm the one who's creating my life here, so I'll be God over it, and I'll decide, right? But Jesus gives us hope. He gives us truth, and it's all based off of him and the Scripture and off of God's Word. And there's some security for you if you're worried about anything in your life or troubling times. Like, there's no greater hope than knowing that we're bought back, right? That I'm going to be resurrected, and I'm going to live with him forever on a new earth that he makes fit just for us. That I'm going to have a place that he builds for me, that he's preparing now, like this home that perfectly fits my personality and things I don't even know about myself. Probably God will be like, yeah, you always loved coffee. So I have coffee. You just didn't know. And he'll have like this awesome coffee maker there, and I'll get there and be like, oh, I didn't know I like coffee. Oh, this is great. Like it's going to be fit perfect for us. We don't even know ourselves as well as God knows us. And we have this beautiful thing to look forward to and this hope. Things that were lost in this life because of sin. Babies that have been lost. Maybe there was a time you could have made a decision to step up and do something work-wise or with your family, or I really believe that second chances are going to be regained. Like, it's just going to be a beautiful thing. And we have that hope. And we're going to live in a body, right? A real body that's resurrected. And we're going to live on a real earth. We're not floaty ghost people. We talked about this in our Heaven series. And it's something to look forward to. And the people who are attacking Jesus don't have any of this hope. They don't know the Scriptures, and they don't know the power of God. And then Jesus gets into his next teaching, because again, he's going to be tricked by these brilliant people who are tricking him. And so we get to the third time they try and do it. Hearing that Jesus had silenced the Sadducees, the Pharisees got together. One of them, an expert in the law, tested him with a question. Teacher, which is the greatest commandment in the law? What is the greatest commandment in the law, by the way? In the Old Testament, what would the Pharisees say the greatest commandment is? Yes, that's right. And what does Jesus answer? Love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your... So they agree on that one, right? I never really thought about that before. That time he answered to their expectation. Thought that was kind of interesting. All right, let's keep going on it. Teacher, which is the greatest commandment in the law? Verse 37, Jesus replied, love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind. This is the first and greatest commandment. And the second is like it. Love your neighbor as yourself. And the law and the prophets hang on these two commandments. Again, I think we see value in people again, right here. I think that God is teaching us the number one goal of your life is to love God and enjoy Him forever. That's the goal of your life, number one, okay? To love Him, to serve Him, to obey Him, to do His will, to enjoy Him. And for so many people who are Christians and have been brought up in like a really religious Christianity, they just can't see how you can obey, and say no to these things and yes to the things God says yes to and enjoy Him. Like they don't realize that He gives the best life. But He does. He gives the best life. And the goal of your life is to love God with all your heart, with all your mind, with all your soul. We do really well a lot of times at loving God with our heart, right? We have like an emotional response, which is good, to the fact that He died on the cross for our sins. I guess we need to put a cross right there. Cross. We need a cross there. I keep pointing at it. It's just normal in churches. I don't know. And then there's other times where maybe we're not doing so good with that, and we're doing good with like our mind being focused on Him. But whatever, maybe you're lacking in an area of loving God. Maybe your mind, we love God with all our mind. Maybe you need to fall in love with God with your mind, right? And get in there and dig it out. Maybe you have gotten in there and dug it out, and you've got some truth in that brain of yours, but you haven't transferred it over to thankfulness and to gratitude and that kind of a thing. We love God with all of our strength. Strength goes right to actions, right? Maybe you know this stuff, and in your mind you're like, yes, I should love God. Cognitively, I know God died on the cross for my sins. He rose again. I can be saved from that sin, so I can be with Him in heaven forever. I should love God. It's here. Got it. All right? And this is what we do with our children, isn't it? Like, how do you get it to go from here to here? Because our kids learn it every week downstairs. So they're getting it here. And I think if you ask pretty much every kid down there, that truth, they'd be like, yes. Should you love God because He died on the cross for you? Yes. Well, how do you, over time, get that to go down here? And then how do you get it to go from here into actions, that we love God with our actions? It's such a small thing. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind. But like living it out, different story. I think we can even evaluate ourselves. Like, has this love for God seeped into my heart? Ask yourself. Like when you're singing places and there's like, do you have to sing? Like even though maybe you're a bad singer, whatever, like when it leaks down to here, it's almost like you have to sing, right? Because you love Him so much. You can kind of judge where you're at based on who you are. Maybe you leave here and you fall right back into sinful habits that, at church you're like, yes, I'm going to be different. I love God. And then you leave and we're not loving God with our actions. Like you can evaluate where you're at. You can ask God to help you. He will build a love for you in Him. He knows we're fallen. He knows we're messed up. You can say to God, I don't even want to love you, God, but will you make me want to love you? Will you make me want to do things that are right? Will you break my will? Because I want to do stuff this way. God, will you break my will and make me that way? And He will. He'll work on you. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind. And notice that you cannot love other people how you're supposed to if you do not love God first. Because if you don't love God first, if you don't believe He's creator, if you don't believe He's made everybody in His own image, if you don't believe what He's done for you on the cross, if you're not in love with God, and you don't know God, and you don't have that mindset, then you cannot correctly love your neighbor. And so, we just don't expect people who don't know God, and don't believe in God, and don't love God, to love us well, right? We don't expect people to value humans, human life. We don't expect people to treat us with human dignity unless They have that framework. And Jesus is telling us that here. That's why we are endowed, all men are created equal and endowed with their Creator by certain unalienable rights, right? Like the people who started our country knew this. They knew, why do we have rights? Why should we value life and value people? Because there's a Creator, and He values us, and we're made in His image. And so we all have these rights because of it. Well, when God starts to go away, people's rights start to go away. And I think in our culture, God can do awesome things to switch us back through the church if we're willing to let Him use us. But I think more and more and more, we're going to see human life and human rights devalued more and more and more and more. And Christians will be the ones that are at the center of that attack, will be seen as bigots, as people who hate, as people who are intolerant. And we're going to talk more and more about that too, and what we can do about that to fix it down the road. But I think God just really struck me with the expectation that we can't love our neighbors well, and that we won't be loved well as people unless there's a love for God centered on who He is, Creator God who has given us value. So that's why it's the first thing. What's the first and greatest commandment? Love God. What's the second commandment that just leaks right out of that one? Love your neighbors. Why do we love our neighbors? Because they have great value. Because God has stamped His image on each and every one of them, and they're valuable to Him. And just in saying that alone is enough to cause us to think about everybody in our life, every relationship we have, things we see on the news, things we've heard people say, and in our hearts has built up anger towards them, or I can't believe that person's this way. Like, when you start to view everybody as somebody made in God's image, and that God values them, it really changes a lot of stuff. Because who's our neighbor, by the way, biblically? Everyone, right? Everyone. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind. This is the first and greatest commandment, and the second is like it. Love your neighbor as yourself. All the law and the prophets hang on these two commandments. And I think in these three attacks against Jesus, we see Jesus replying with, people are valuable. They're made in God's image. Look at the hope we have in the resurrection. Look how valuable people are, that God won't let His children see decay, a psalm says, right? We're that valuable. I think those are just awesome truths for us to grasp and to know. And we come to the end of a series about Jesus being our King. And the whole time, it's said underneath that this is about choosing Jesus' reign in your life. And we've heard Jesus teach us what it looks like to live in the kingdom of heaven. We've heard proof that He is the King. We've seen the power from the King, right, where He goes out and He does miracles. We've seen the call from the King for us to go out and to serve people in that same power in Matthew 10. We've seen parables that show us how valuable it is to be a part of this kingdom. How valuable is it to let God rule your life? Well, it's like a treasure hidden in a field. And when the guy found the treasure and he saw how valuable it was, he got rid of everything else, because the kingdom of heaven, having God rule your life, is so incredibly valuable that it's worth getting rid of everything else for. Like, we've been through that kind of stuff, right? Around Easter, we went through the truth of the cross. And today, talking about a king who's willing to suffer and die and sacrifice and wash our feet. And we serve an awesome king. And we could teach the book of Matthew for 400 years. I did 400 on purpose that time, because I was doing 400 earlier. Did you catch that? See what I did there? That was, anyways. It has to end sometime. God has called us to work on and to teach other things. But I hope that you have seen a picture of Jesus maybe in new ways. I hope that as you've gone through the scriptures and you've seen in the book of Matthew miracles and different things like that, that it causes you just to be in awe of Him more and more. And, if you've gotten through this and you just kind of endured, because it's been kind of long, and long series, and maybe you're like, what is he talking about sometimes, and isn't that the same thing you said last week? There's a lot of repetitive ideas when you talk about choosing Jesus as your King. Choose Jesus as your King. Choose Jesus as your King. Choose Jesus as your King. So I pray that you just take it further. I'm not going to take it further, but you take it further in your own life, in your own heart. Read it again. Study it. I can give you sources online where you can type in a passage and you can read what Bible scholars think about it, and just keep asking yourself the question, what does it look like to choose Jesus as my king in this area of my life? What does it look like to choose Jesus as my king in my marriage right now? Right? In my family right now? With this political thing that's happening and my response to it right now. What does it look like to choose Jesus as your king? And that's a question we should always be asking. And we should always be answering and jumping into when he tells us what it does look like. But that's my prayer for this, that it would continue on and that question would just ring through our heads. Like, well, we learned the book of Matthew. We've seen what the disciples did. What does it look like for me to choose Jesus in this instance right now? So, yeah. God, we thank you so much for who you are. Praise you for all you've done. Thank you for the book of Matthew. Thank you for this tax collector who most people wouldn't have even given a second look at, that you called to be your disciple. We praise you, God, for the life that he lived, that he let the Spirit work through him to write this book so that we could have just this great coronation anthem just ringing through the whole thing of how great a king you are. And you're worthy to be followed. You're worthy to be bowed down to in every area of our life. And I pray that you would keep showing us what areas those are and giving us the strength to do that. And we just praise you, God, for all you'll do. In Christ's name we pray. Amen.